everyone. Welcome to the Barron Art Center. My name is Antonia. I am the chair of the Education Committee here. Can you hear me? Yes? Yes? Okay. I'm the chair of the Education Committee here at the Barron Art Center, along with our commissioners. I know we have Jerry and a couple other commissioners, Jeff over here, Cohen. I don't know who else, Jane's not here tonight, the usuals that come in. And along with Cynthia and Brandon, who work here at the Art Center, we put together these programs for you. So thank you so much for always coming and having a great audience here. Tonight we're in the second part of our series of the French Impressionists, so we're going to be speaking on Monet. And we have Maryann Zolota. She teaches at Holyrood, and some of you may be her students. I'm not sure, because she has a good following that comes every year. So she's been doing this for over 20 years, and she also does this on cruise ships, the Seabourn and the Crystal and Regent cruise ships. She has her BA in Art History from Drew University and her MA from Rutgers. And she's lectured since 2009 with Rutgers University Adult Education Program. So without further ado, I will introduce Maryann to speak on Monet. Thank you so much for coming.
I want to thank Antonia for having me here again. First of all, before we begin, I made adjustments to my reading list, and you have, most of you I believe have taken the reading list. It's an introduction to the literature of the time, and also, of course, to the art history at the time. Now, you also have a list of Edouard Manet. Now, when I prepared this lecture, I went through it 2 or 3 days ago and timed myself, and it was much too long, went way beyond an hour and a half. So it was incumbent upon me to remove 3 of the slides. Now, they will not at all interfere with the flow or with the amount of information I'm going to give you, but I want to tell you which ones they are, all right? The first one is toward the very bottom, third up from the bottom, Madame Suzanne Manet, that was eliminated. And on the following page, the view of the Paris World's Fair was also eliminated, and the 3 down from that, Chez la Pierre la Tuile, that was also eliminated, okay, in order to fit this lecture into an hour and a half time frame. Now, we're going to start talking about Edouard Manet. He was born in 1832 to a very upper middle class family in France, in Paris. His father was a magistrate and a judge, and his mother, believe it or not, was the goddaughter of the Crown Prince of Sweden. So she was very, very highly placed in social circles, and they've traveled in the highest social circles in Paris as well. Now, he began to, his first education was to prepare him for the law. His father wanted him to be a lawyer. There were 3 sons in the family. Edward was the oldest. And he went to school, went to law school for 1 year, but he absolutely hated it. In fact, he failed out. He just could not wrap his head around it, okay? So he was always very interested in sailing and in the sea. So he decided to go for a year sign on as a sailor on a ship for 1 year, with the idea that when he came home, he would prepare for taking the exam at the École de Saint-Cyr, which is the naval school in France, similar to our Annapolis. Well, he took the 1 year sailing apprenticeship, came back, took the test, and failed it twice, and could not get into naval school. Now, the parents were, of course, by this time beside themselves. They expected their sons to follow in a particular tradition, if you know what I mean. And he had been taught by his uncle. He had taught his uncle, Monsieur Fournet, would always take him to the Louvre, and he also taught him to draw. And Edward always really wanted to give it a whirl, to give himself a chance to see if he could succeed in the art world. So in 1850, he became a student of Thomas Couture. I mentioned him deliberately last month so that you would see some of his works. He was a salon artist, and you know what the salon is, correct? And he painted the painting. Remember the decadence, the Romans of the Decadence, which of course was the typical kind of history painting they did, with a very glossy, smooth finish and done with great precision. It was the kind of thing that the salon accepted. Now, after working with Thomas Couture for a number of years, by 1862, he had 2 of his works accepted by the Salon, and also he was written up very favorably by the critics, and of course this opened the door for him to be a successful artist in France, and to have a following, and to have people come to purchase his paintings. However, by 1863, everything kind of exploded, and it was his fault. Everything exploded in his face because he began going his own way. He wanted to be accepted by the Salon, but he also wanted to, shall we say, forge his own path. So things began to change a little bit for him. Now, in 1863, he was hung at the salon, which was known as the Salon de Refusés, the refused ones. That is to say, the artists who could not get into the regular salon. There were more than 1,000 paintings that were rejected that year. So the artists went to the Minister of Arts, and they said, look, all of us have been rejected, but we have a right to be seen by the public, and let the public make up their minds about the work that we do. So that's exactly what happened. And of course, when people saw the Salon de Refusés, the refused ones, they said, hey, let's go see the refused ones. They were more interested in the refused ones than seeing the regular salon, because it was the usual Meissoniers and whatnot. But this was something completely different. And I'm going to show you one of the paintings he had in the Salon de Refusés in 1863. Okay, wait a minute. Now, in 1863, he also married Suzanne Leenhoff. She was a Dutch woman who had come to Paris, and she was the piano teacher to all 3 of the Manet brothers. The parents wanted them to be cultured. They gave them the privilege of piano lessons. Now, Suzanne later on had to go back to Holland because, unfortunately, Suzanne was going to have a baby. She went back to Holland, had the child, and brought him back to France as her quote-unquote little brother. Now, we do not know the parentage of the boy. However, the child was given the name Leon Edward Leenhoff, after Edouard Manet. Now, art historians have also conjectured that perhaps the child is the child's father. It would be Edouard Manet's father was fathered as Susan's child. However, the child could have been Edouard Manet's because around 1870 the French changed the laws. If you had an illegitimate child, the child could be legitimized and you could recognize the child. Edward never did that with Leon. Maybe because he didn't want to embarrass Susan or whatever, I don't know. But Manet was the godfather of Leon, and he called him his stepson, and for the rest of his life, this was the relationship. Edward died in the arms of Leon Leenhoff. And Leenhoff always spoke very, very fondly of the man he called his godfather. Now, in 1867, there was a World's Fair in Paris. And Edward decided that he wanted to, if he had a one-man showing, and all these people, these thousands of people were coming to Paris, surely they would go to his one-man show, and perhaps he'd be able to sell a number of his paintings. He didn't have enough money for this, so he borrowed money, took money, asked money from his mother. His mother gave him the money, which she gave him about 2,000 or 3,000 francs for this endeavor. Well, it was a miserable failure. Even though Emile Zola wrote very favorably about his work, it still was a failure. Now, at that point, Madame Manet said to her son, you know, she said, you're really running up quite a lot of money, she said, here, and we've got to economize a little bit. So they economized by having Edward and Susan move in with the mother-in-law, with her. So in other words, poor Susan Manet had to live with her mother-in-law because the mother-in-law said they were spending too much money. Okay, now, in 1874, he was the leader of the avant-garde. Now, he was older than all of the Impressionists. He was born in 1832, and in 1840, Renoir was born, and I believe 1838, Monet was born. So, I mean, he was at least 6 to 8 years older than most of the Impressionists. So that's the reason why he was kind of like the leader, all right? He had an early success and was the leader of the group. They would go to his studio and whatnot, and he always was very, very receptive to their ideas. They would meet at a little cafe near his studio called the Café Gerbois, and they would all get together and have coffee and wine and whatnot and hash over the current status of painting in Paris. Now, to the end of his life, he was the urbane, amiable, and polished Parisian. All accounts of him always talk about the fact that he was impeccably dressed, he had exquisite manners, he was very amiable, and very, very sympathetic toward all people, and you will see this in some of his work as I go along. Now, we are going to start looking at some Spanish works. Because Manet was a rather well-off man, it would enable him to travel. And he went to Spain, to Madrid, where he saw the works of the 17th century Spanish painters such as Velazquez, Murillo, Zurbarán, and he was very, very impressed by them. And he absorbed a lot, and he took it back with him. Now, this is one of Velazquez's paintings called The Drinkers, or Los Borrachos. In the center, we see the god of wine right here, Bacchus, being crowned by a group of guys who basically look like really average guys. They look like they're slightly inebriated, okay? And there was a man in the background. You see the man in the background tipping his hat right there? All right, that figure would be picked up by Manet, as would all of these rather common genre types. They're not handsome, they're not well dressed, they're just really the guys in the neighborhood, so to speak. And here on the ground is two jugs, obviously jugs of wine, and this ancillary still life, the use of an ancillary still life in paintings was picked up also by Manet. Now I'm going to show you another work here. This is Velazquez's Water Carrier of Seville. This is a very, very humble theme, but it's infused with a great deal of dignity. Despite the poor clothing of both people, the gentleman here offers a glass of water to the lad, almost as, and look at the glass. The glass looks very much like a chalice, doesn't it? It almost is infused with a religious aspect to it, how carefully he hands the glass to him. And there are some earthenware jugs right here, the kind of thing that would be found, let's say, in a farmhouse or in a very simple household. And note the color. There is also another figure here in the shadow, and that the light comes this way, and of course it reflects off of the crockery, so that you can see that this is very simple, humble kind of crockery done by a peasant. Now, he was also influenced by, here is one of his very early paintings called the Absinthe Drinker. Now, in order to show exactly, now there is the absinthe. Absinthe was a liquor made from wormwood, and it was a green distillate, and it led to delirium and addiction. In other words, if you drank absinthe, you became addicted to it, and after a while you were very, shall we say, spaced out. And you can see here, the man is cloaked. He's wearing a cloak with a hat pulled down over his head. This is another thing that Manet got from the from Goya, from the Goya's mahos, the men who walked around in the black capes and the hat over their head. We will see a maho later on this evening. But also, look at the very acid color he uses. The greenish color, not only in the glass, but also on the ground. And there, of course, is a discarded bottle of absinthe. And even the wall behind the drinker right here. He himself looks very weightless, doesn't he? And he's very flat. There is no modeling at all. It's extremely flat. And it looks as if he's kind of like not really quite seated and not really quite standing, and it really looks like he's floating a little bit. But of course, this may be his way of saying that the man is spaced out by his head is in the clouds. Now, here is another painting that he did called The Old Musician. The man in the center is, believe it or not, a man by the name of Jean Lagrine, who was a member of the Parisian gypsy colony. In other words, he went out in the street and dragged these people into his studio and began painting. Now, the little girl holding the child, right here, the little girl holding the child, comes from Murillo, as do the two beggar boys right here. Murillo did paintings of beggar boys, many paintings of beggars and poor children, and he picked that up on that as well. You can see the costumes that they are wearing. And there again, there is that same caped figure that he used in the previous painting. So you can see that he takes figures from other people and puts them together and creates kind of a pastiche. Now, on the very edge, you will, I didn't mean to do that. On the very edge, right there, there is another figure wearing one of those Astrakhan hats. He is, of course, the Wandering Jew. But note that he has been cut off very severely at the edge. That shows the influence of photography. All of the Impressionists and the artists in Paris that followed the Impressionist aesthetic were very, very interested in photography, because they saw that when pictures were done with a camera, somewhere along the line something got cut off very, very abruptly. So they began working this into their compositions, and we are going to see this quite a bit, not only with Manet, but also with Monet and Renoir, and even with Degas as well. But also, look, the colors. The colors are very, very earth tones, very, very much like the kind of colors that Rembrandt would have used. But I also want you to look at the brushstroke. The brushstroke is very, what we would call kind of easy. And the brushstrokes are very broad. They are not done in a very tidy way. They are broad brushstrokes, and you can, if you look, for example, at the beggar boy right here, you can see the brushstrokes. You can see the mottled coloring of the boy's costume and the background as well. Now, this Spanish singer was the painting that everyone talked about, and he did it in 1860, but he didn't submit it to the Salon until 1862, and this is one of the things that people looked upon favorably. He was, again, here he is using a genre peasant type, a man singing and playing the guitar, very, very broad areas of color, all right, with a dark background. And someone later pointed out to Manet after he did the painting, he said, you've got that guitar in the wrong position. You know, guitars have to be played with the left hand because the way the guitar is strung. And he said, he can't play that guitar with the way you've got it. He said, you've got to change that. And Manet said, I'm not going to change it. I'm going to leave it exactly the way it was because it's part of my composition. In other words, he asserted the right of a painter to, shall we say, manipulate reality if he wanted to, and to paint it the way he wanted to paint it. Now, it's important that the position of this guitar is very important, because if you look again on the ground here, you will see a still life right there. An earthenware jug 2 onions, and a couple of bulbs of garlic, including another one that's been tossed here. Now, if you look at this one bulb of garlic right here, and you trace your eye all the way up, past his knee, past the second knee, all the way up, you get to the very, very end of the guitar. It was part of his composition, and it is the line that draws the eye inward and upward, and he wasn't going to change it for anybody. So this got very, very good press reviews, by the way, and the family was so happy. At long last, he had some success. Okay. Now, we're going to look again. Now, I'm showing this to you because you see this jug right here, the little red jug with the long neck right there. Now, this also was cribbed from another artist, from none other than Zurbarán. Now, Zurbarán did many, many still lifes. He was also famous for his pictures of individual saints, which are just out of this world. What he does here, he takes some very, very simple, humble objects, arranges them on a stone shelf. Note the color combination. It's a very, very, it's toward the quiet end of the palette. It's red, it's tan, it's a little bit of cream color, but it's very carefully arranged to give a particular balance. For example, let's start on the left. Now we see, first of all, this is obviously metal, and you can read that because of the reflections. So we have an ellipse right there, and also in the top of the cup there is another ellipse. Next to that, there is a jug with a 2-handled jug with a fluted edge. It also is an ellipse, but the ellipse is fluted. Next to that, there is the jar that we just saw, probably a wine jug, and with the long neck, and there we have a circle right there. But here, notice here, the way the handles were placed, and here he has turned it just slightly. Okay, so you get another view of a double-handled pitcher. And here, at the very end, we see another plate that holds another vessel, which was kind of a tan color, and the fluting is here on but the lid, I mean the lip of it right here, again, is another ellipse. So he's creating a series of ellipses and circles on the painting. Now this is also a circle right here, and then again you have the ear. Here is another small lower circle, and here is another circle. So he's creating almost a geometric composition of ellipses, circles, and of course there is also this horizontal line that goes clear across the canvas. Okay, this is the kind of thing that Zurbarán did. He took the most humble objects and he arranged them in a beautiful way. In other words, he's saying these objects may be humble, but they have their own, shall we say, simple beauty. And the light that comes in, the light that just goes across is just absolutely lovely. Now, this also would be, this use of humble objects was also picked up in the 18th century by Jean-Simeon Chardin, who was from France. And it was also picked up by the Dutch in the 17th century as well. Oops. Okay, now, here is another one of his early paintings, the Ragpicker. Now, this was, by the way, a real rag picker. Okay, this is not a model posing. It's the real local rag picker. Now, he was, of course, the marginal. The rag picker was. We don't have them anymore, but in those days there were rag pickers that would pick up rags and sell them and whatnot. A marginal member of society, the underclass. Very popular with Spanish artists as well, and realists such as Courbet. Now, the old man has an almost defiant stare as he warily looks out from under his hat brim. He is an outcast of society who works at night gathering scraps of the urban life as seen in the still life here at his feet. Again, Manet employs a still life of some scraps here to emphasize his status and what he does for a living. Rag pickers were usually harassed by the police because they were not part of the mainstream of society. Now, the next part of the lecture is going to discuss the controversy and outrage that Manet created starting in 1863 at the Salon des Refusés. This was one of the paintings that the jury refused and was hung in the Salon des Refusés. It is a very large painting. It is more than 7 feet high and more than 6 feet across. So it's not one of these little things that you can ignore. It's very, very big, and it hits you in the face, okay? This one, Luncheon on the Grass. Now, it created a sensation because Manet slyly uses a composition from an engraving by the Renaissance artist Raphael, where he, and here, however, he places a model. Everyone knew her, everyone in the art circles anyway, knew her in Paris. Her name was Victorine Meurent. There is his brother, and this man here is his son, not son-in-law, I'm sorry, his brother-in-law. And now what we have is a nude woman with 2 men seated on the ground in a very casual conversation, and it's almost as if this was absolutely nothing. Now I'm going to show you the engraving upon which this painting is based, so you will understand a little more about it. This is a Raphael painting, a lost Raphael, and the engraving was done by Raimondi in Italy. And you can see here, if you look right there in this corner, there is Manet's composition. So he took it from a classical themed work and transposed it into a contemporary setting with a nude woman. Now, if he had undressed those guys and called it Luncheon of the Gods, it would have been perfectly okay. Nobody would have been offended. But he had the nerve to transpose it from ancient history into a contemporary scene. Of course, as I said, Meurent was a very well-known model in the arts of Paris. And there he has a still life of food being eaten there, with there's bread, there's fruit and whatnot. She has cast off her dress, as you can see, and she's even sitting on part of it because the grass must have been quite ticklish, okay? So there was something else additional in this painting, which you have to look for very carefully. In this corner right here, and you're going to have to take my word for it, okay, there is a frog. Well, frogs appear in the woods. The word in French for frog is grenouille, and grenouille was used as a slang for prostitute. So in other words, he's really rubbing it in, if you know what I mean. He's really rubbing it in, and of course anybody who saw the frog would know immediately what would make the connection, you see. So
excuse me, where was the frog?
Now Manet's figures really are generally lost in their own thought. The only one who is actually aware of us and looking at us to see our reaction is Victorine Meurent. The other 2 guys, they're kind of talking, but even the one who's gesturing, the fellow here isn't looking at him at all. He's looking out as well, and his eyes are kind of not looking basically at us, but he's looking out that way. She, however, has looking directly at us. And it was the outrage to see something like that. They considered it absolutely outrageous. They really, really did. Now, if he had idealized them, or if he said again, Luncheon of the Gods, it would have been perfectly all right. But not in a situation like this. So you see how he tweaks everything. This is something that Manet does with many of his paintings. Now, in the following year, in the Salon of 1865, another painting appeared called Olympia, again referential to Olympus, where the gods came from. Well, now here is Victorine Meurent again as Olympia. Now, this was shown this was done in 1863, but it was shown 2 years later again at the Salon de Refusés again. and it evoked laughter, mockery, and catcalls. Here is Victorine Murat posed against a dark background as if she were a Venus, because, of course, the name alludes to classical Greek art. Now, the black maid presents her with a large bouquet. Bouquets of flowers were generally given to gentlemen when they were courting ladies. Victorine, and just from the fact that she's sitting on the bed, and look where she has her left hand, all of this indicates that she is a kept woman. Now, there is also, at the foot of the bed, I hope you can see it. I'm going to put the light on it there. Whoops, sorry, put the light on it right there. There is a little kitty, a little black cat with green eyes that is looking out at us. I think you can make out the green eyes right there, right? Now, when Emile Zola reviewed this painting, because everybody was talking about it. Everybody was. In fact, people expected him to do something outrageous like this. Look at what he did 2 years ago. So, Zola talked about the famous black cat that has so amused the public. Now, the cat appears in many of Manet's works, and it is possible, many people have said, many art historians have said, that the cat is his alter ego. In other words, it's his way of planting himself on the painting, you see, putting himself there, because the little cat also looks out at us. The cat is looking at us the same way that Victorine is looking at us to in a sense, judge what we are, to try and figure out what we are thinking about. Now, this was a very scandalous painting. As a matter of fact, they had to put a guard by the painting because somebody tried to attack it with a cane and beat it to death, okay? Now, it was scandalous because of the bold stare. Again, she is looking, and she's not hiding anything, is she? She's looking, and she is reminding men of the women that they kept. And it was calculated to make the onlooker uncomfortable, because at the time it was quite okay for a man to have a mistress. And all of the men who came and looked at this immediately were cast into the part of, again, someone who does this kind of thing. You see, keeps a mistress. Also, staring, as you know, is impolite. Even today, you don't stare at someone. If you do, then it's considered rather impolite, and you smile and you kind of look away. So, but here she is in this unrelenting stare, looking straight at us, and say, yeah, I may be a kept woman, but you're keeping a lot of women as well, all right? So in other words, it was calculated to make men feel uncomfortable, and make people feel uncomfortable because of the stare and the flowers, etc., and also the position of where she is on the bed, etc. So it was all calculated by Manet to give an uncomfortable feeling. Now let's look at another painting he did in 1863. It's called the Dead Toreador, another Spanish theme. This work, however, was cut from a larger painting of a bullfight. Manet did the painting. He didn't like it. But he liked this one figure, so he took a knife or a scissor and he cut it out, and he framed it. But there is no ancillary figures or props to add meaning. It is simply the fact of death with no transcendent meaning whatsoever. Now notice that his legs are splayed out as if in a still life. Indeed, it is the ultimate still life because it is a life that has been stilled. Now, if you look here, the only evidence of what happened to this poor guy is by his shoulder right here. Oops. Oh my. By his shoulder right here, there is a little bit of blood on the ground. That's the only indication of how he died, okay? Now, the reality of death was a popular subject in the 19th century, not only with the Impressionists, but also with the English Victorian artists as well. Death was ever present with them because in the 19th century, diseases such as measles, whooping cough, pneumonia, etc., took people, cholera, typhoid fever from the and typhus from the impure water, took literally thousands of people's lives every year. We don't have to face that because these basic things have been addressed and cured. We have pure water. We make sure our milk is pasteurized and all that kind of thing, so that we avoid these diseases. Tuberculosis, for example, was a scourge in the 19th century until they came up with a cure for it. So, in other words, the idea of death was ever present. As a matter of fact, many times, if you lost a member of the family, you would have a photograph done of the dead person, or a painting done of the dead person, which seems, well, kind of unusual for us, but this was the way they did things in those days, especially when it was a child that had died, and the mother wanted to have a picture of the child. All right, now let's look at this. Now I'm going to show you a still life. Still life with carp. I chose this because if you look at the tail of the fish, it looks very, very much like the splayed legs of the Toreador, does it not? Now, here he synthesizes elements from the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish realism for this still life. Now, there was a still life revival in the 19th century that overcame the preference for elevated subject matter favored by the salon. Because of the interest, too, in gardens and in flowers, with all the parkland that Haussmann created, there was also a resurgence of still life floral painting. And with Fontaine-Latour, but also with Manet, Monet. I mean, Monet painted more gardens than you could possibly imagine. Manet, Monet, Renoir, Degas, Caillebotte, all of these men went out to the garden and painted in the garden. Now, we also have here touches of Dutch painting, because don't forget, his wife was Dutch, and many times they went to Holland to visit the family, and he would go to the Amsterdam museums and other museums as well, including perhaps Marat's house, which had been open since 1822. Now, you see the lemon there, the lemon, and the knife at an angle, okay? That comes from the Dutch paintings. Invariably on a Dutch still life, you will see a knife at an angle indicating that someone is coming to eat or has eaten. Sometimes the crumbs are there, so you know that they have eaten. There is also here a copper fish poacher, which, of course, as you can see, the way the light catches it. And there is an accumulation of oysters, clams, so I don't know what those red fish are, I really don't, and also an eel here slithering across the tablecloth. Note again the very broad brushstrokes that he uses. His hand is becoming very, very confident. And the brushstroke has changed from the Spanish singer of 4 years before to a much looser brushstroke. So, now let's look at something else now. This next painting was shown at the Salon de Refusés in 1864. In other words, he was always showing at the Salon de Refusés. His work was not in the salon. At first he was so successful, but these other paintings were put in the rejected bin, so to speak. This one is called Dead Christ with Angels, done in 1864. A critic, Théophile Gautier, normally sympathetic to Manet, was appalled at this painting. Because of its earthly realism, there was no real devotional appeal here at all. The dead Christ is simply being presented by the two angels who show little emotion. This one shows no emotion whatsoever. This one, she's a little bit upset. She's resting her hand in her head in her hand. Critics hated it. And you know why they hated it? They said, Christ looked dead. Really? All right, okay. Now, Manet also, he knew that, maybe it's an error here, he knew that the wound of Christ was on the right side, so he put it on the right side of the painting. It really should have been on the other side, should it not, okay? Should have been here, not there. So in other words, again, he's taking, shall we say, artistic license with this work. Now, it is not a resurrection scene. it is more a lamentation, but even there is little enough of that as well. It simply is the mundane truth of dying without any transcendent meaning, and this is something that the French public simply could not take. Now, we're going back to Spain for a minute. Here is Goya's The 3rd of May. This incident happened on the 3rd of May in 1808, but Goya was not able to paint it until 6 years later, because he knew, this is a very large painting, by the way, it's not something you can tuck away in a cupboard, okay? He knew if the authorities came and found this painting, he would be probably arrested and maybe taken to jail as well. The work is Goya's reaction to the outrage of the Mameluke troops on the Spanish. Now, we know that the French had invaded Spain, and Napoleon had set his brother up on the throne, but they had also hired Mameluke soldiers from North Africa to as mercenaries. And one day, as the Mamelukes were going through Madrid, a mob of people set upon the Mamelukes, and many of them were killed, but so were many of the Spanish as well. Now, the next night, the remaining people who they were able to round up were rounded up, and at night they did this, and each of them were summarily simply shot. Now, when you look at this, look at the man in the middle there, where all the light is shining on him, and he's got here this lantern that looks like it's got about 1,000 watts of electricity in it, right here, this huge lantern, and the light is shining on this one figure in the middle, and his hands are raised almost as if he's being crucified. And you can see that next to him there is a friar, a priest, who is almost kneeling in supplication, and there are some people that have already been shot. And there is a mindless group of soldiers, simply a row of soldiers. They are all anonymous. They have these large shakos over their heads, and they are simply summarily executing each of these people. And there are others behind just waiting to be executed. Right here, they are waiting to be executed. They know they are next, and every one of them is being executed. Now, it is believed that Goya, in the dark of night, went to this spot and made sketches of what he saw. And that after the slaughter was over, he wouldn't go there while the soldiers were there. But Goya's gardener always said that he went there that night and made sketches. He kept the sketches, and he did not do the paintings until 6 years later. Now, here is the execution of Maximilian. In 1862, the French invaded Mexico. Who knows why they did it? Well, one of the reasons they did it at that time is because they knew they would get no interference from the Americans, because they were defying the Monroe Doctrine. They knew they would get no interference for the Americans because the Americans were fighting each other in their Civil War. So they set up a puppet government with the cousin of the Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria and his wife Carlotta were named the rulers of Mexico. Now, Maximilian really tried to help the Mexican people. He learned Spanish. He was trying to modernize the country, but the Mexicans hated the French. They absolutely hated them. Now, the Carlotta then begged him not to abdicate, and she went back to France, to Napoleon. And from Napoleon, she went to the Pope, begging for troops to be sent to quell the uprising. But her pleas were in vain. They were basically being set up as victims, all right? He was killed in July 1867, and she went insane. She lived until about 1920, and every night when she went to bed, she took a doll with her, and she said, "This is my husband, we're going to bed." Now, Manet made from a description in the newspaper, he created this painting. But it was not allowed to be shown. Now, again, we have the same pose of these mindless activity of these soldiers standing here anonymous soldiers with their hats on. Here's one of them who was reloading, and all the others just shooting Maximilian, and he had two of his retainers on either side of him. And so and here is a wall, and behind the wall there is a group of people just kind of looking and observing the situation. For them, it's a slight diversion for a few minutes. So, in other words, again, it's the idea of death with their no transcendent reason whatsoever. This is not noble. This is not whatever. It's just another kind of slaughter. As I said, Manet could not show this because he would probably have been arrested. Now, I'm going to show you here. There's a picture of Maximilian and Carlotta. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Manet's portraits. He loved doing portraits, especially of fashionable women. But I'm going to show you a portrait here of one of his best friends, the writer Emile Zola, in 1868. He shows him as a learned man. First of all, he's got an open book, which looks like an art book right there, okay? He's also very, very flat. There is no real modeling of the figure at all. He's quite flat. But he has really worked up the face very well. And there is a series of pamphlets, probably pamphlets written by Zola, and with a pen and ink. And above him hangs like a tack board, a bulletin board. And on it, first of all, is a print of Los Borrachos. Below that is a print of Olympia. Okay, because Zola had given Manet a number of critical praises for all of his paintings. And above that, too, is a print of a Japanese lord. And here also is a screen, a room divider, with what appears to be a Japanese print. I want to tell you now that in the 1860s, suddenly Japanese prints began appearing in France, and the artists were fascinated with it. They were fascinated because the aesthetic of the Japanese art, shall we say, negated perspective. Everything was flat, but everything was very, very done in a very, very graceful manner, and the compositions were beautiful, and they emphasized nature, but the figures themselves were very flat. But they were very, very decorative in the fabrics and in the way of portraying their landscape. The landscapes were perfectly flat. And they would be just, it was the only way you could get an idea of perspective was that placing one thing behind the other and working your way backward. So they began incorporating some of this into their compositions. And obviously, Zola was very, very interested in this Japanese prints, and so there was one there as well. So really, this painting really is an homage to Zola. Now, Zola remained a lifelong friend of Monet's, calling him a man of exquisite politeness and extreme amiability. Now, I'm going to show you another Velazquez. This is Pablo de Valladolid, who was the court jester to the Spanish court. And he is placed here against a plain gray background with nothing to define the figure or to place the figure in space except for a bit of shadowing right here along his feet. And notice the grayish blue background, a little bit of blue right here, the gray background and the black clothing. But the man has volume. The body has volume. This is very difficult to do without there being any props for you to any. Let's say a chair or a table there, which would actually help to anchor the figure in space. This is simply the court jester. But notice, Velazquez does not portray him as a fool. He portrays him almost as an actor, giving a let's say a monologue to an audience. He does not look foolish or silly at all. He may have been the jester, but he took his work very, very seriously. Now, the body itself has substance, and the artist's conception as an actor in the theater of the world. And again, there is a great deal of dignity there. Now, Manet was familiar with this when he did this painting of Rouvière as Hamlet. Rouvière was a French actor who had played Hamlet for 20 years, starting in 1847. His portrayal with a black cloak, the pointed beard is based on a series of lithographs done by Eugène Delacroix, a friend of the actor. As a matter of fact, all Hamlets from that time on always appear in a black outfit. And as a matter of fact, one of the mother or the king says to him, "Why do you not cast off this black dominie?" All right, the black outfit, and of course shown with a beard and with a sword as well. And so this was Rouvière's way of portraying Hamlet. The critics loved his Hamlet, but the public less so. They didn't like it as much as the critics did. It may have been a very, very broad portrayal. When I say broad, very, very dramatic portrayal of Hamlet. Now, the tradition of painting an actor in his most famous role was very common at that time. Even Edmund Kean in England in the 18th century was painted in some of his more famous role, as was Sarah Bernhardt. Also, she was photographed in some of her more famous roles as well. This, however, was rejected at the Salon of 1866. Now, why would one reject something like this? There was no reason. This was certainly not anything controversial. All it is an actor, and he anchors him beautifully to the ground again by using the same kind of shadowing he saw with the Velazquez painting. And you notice how he varies the background here. The part that anchors where he is anchored to the floor is brighter, the brighter shade of green, and it slowly fades out. Do you notice that? Okay. And of course, the sword also creates a shadow right here, and so you have some diagonals going backward into the painting, which also places him in space. But I ask you, what was so controversial about this painting that it could not be hung in the Salon of 1866? It was refused. Maybe they were getting even with Manet, I don't know, for the other outrageous paintings that he had done, but there was nothing controversial about this whatsoever. All right, now, the next painting is again something he loved to do, Berthe Morisot. Who was she? Well, at this time, she was a friend of Manet's, but within a year, she would be his sister-in-law because she married Eugène Manet, Edouard Manet's brother. And Manet always adored her. They had a wonderful relationship together, and I am not suggesting anything improper. He was the one that really pushed for the marriage of Berthe and his brother. He really pushed for it. At one point, he even said, well, maybe we should let them go away together for the weekend, which is absolutely outrageous thing. Of course, it would have destroyed her reputation completely. Again, she's wearing all black. This is another reason why Manet is not really considered an impressionist. He used an awful lot of black, and the impressionists tried not to use black because, of course, all the colors, black absorbs all the colors of the rainbow, and nothing is thrown back into your eyes. But here, she is dressed in the height of fashion at the time. Notice, too, that the way he paints her face, right here, it's very sharply divided right down the middle with the line on the nose into light and dark. There were no medium half tones to move your eye from the light into the dark. But she's wearing the latest clothing. Now, Berthe Morisot was extremely thin, almost anorexic, and she had black eyes and she had black eyebrows and this black hair, and Manet loved black. And that's the way he painted her in this just shortly before she married his brother. Manet's women are always very cool and chic, and he said, the latest fashion is absolutely necessary for a painting. It's what matters the most. In other words, you have to have the latest clothes on, the latest clothes from Charles, Charles, I've forgotten his name now. Okay, it'll come to me. He was an English designer, but he went to France, and he was quite the, the Chanel of his day, all right? Anyway, so let's look here. This was a little still life that he did for Berthe Morisot. It was a charming one done for her as an offering to her, as a gentleman might offer flowers to a lady, especially violets. Violets were very popular at the time and were a very popular flower to give in little nosegays like that when you went off to the opera or when you went to the ballet. It shows Manet's good breeding. The fan and the nosegay as a prop a lady would use when going to the theater. The note folded as a billet doux, which is a love letter, but when it's open, it says to Bertha from Edward. Now, this painting is extremely small. And in 1983, when they did, in 1981, I'm sorry, when they did a 100th anniversary of Manet at the Met, it was 7 or 8 galleries filled with Manets. This was there, and I saw it. It was absolutely charming painting. It was just wonderful. And knowing the history of it, it makes it even nicer to appreciate and easier to appreciate. Okay, now we're going to start talking about the Parisian scenes. Oh, Charles Worth was the name of the designer. I'm sorry, Charles Worth was the English designer. As a matter of fact, my friend in New Zealand is a great-grandniece of Charles Worth. But he and his son ran the couturier studio from the 1860s into the 1920s. The only thing that's still left with the Worth name is the perfume Je Reviens, which was formulated during the First World War and which means I will return, meaning the soldier would return to his wife or his fiancée. And that's the only thing they still make Je Reviens perfume. So. All right, now we're going to be looking at Parisian scenes. Ross King in his book calls this an ill-defined mob of Parisians loitering and gossiping in a park. Yes, they did, because on Sunday they had music in the park. Suddenly they had this wonderful parkland, the Tuileries Gardens, and they would have a band on Sunday afternoon, and everybody made a beeline for the park. And naturally, it is a mob. First of all, you see 2 little girls right here. This, by the way, is Manet's aunt right there. 2 little girls here. And he put some of his friends in here as well. And notice that all these guys are wearing top hats. If you were a gentleman in those days, you would never leave your house without your hat. And it had to be a top hat, even during the day. If you were a workman, you wore a different kind of cap. If you were middle class, you probably wore a bowler. But if you were a real gentleman, you had to have a top hat on. And I'm going to show you another painting with a lot of top hats on it. But it's simply a massing of people in the garden. And it really looks like a mob scene, does it not? But it's contemporary Paris, contemporary for the time. Suddenly we have this wonderful park and we've got this live music on a Sunday. What a great way to spend your time. And of course, everybody went, so it was a mingling of all the classes, the poorer class, the middle class, and the aristocrats as well. I mean, suddenly, street activity was entertainment. This was absolutely entertainment, and it was outside. So it was embraced very, very strongly, very, very enthusiastically, I should say, by the Parisians. Now here's another one called The Masked Ball at the Opera. Now here is what I was talking about. A relentless row of black hats. Without end, a row of black hats. By the way, that right there, that's Manet's self-portrait. He's putting himself in the painting, and he signed it down here on the little piece of paper you see there. That's where it was signed. Now, what is this all about? Well, they would have these masked balls at the opera, not at the Opera Garnier. The Opera Garnier was not yet built. That wasn't built till the 1880s. This picture was done in 1873. So don't get it mixed up with the big opera house at the top of the Rue de l'Opéra in Paris, okay? Don't get it mixed up. Now, what's happening here? Well, they would have these masked balls where you could come and you would wear a mask, all right, or you could wear a costume. Now, many of these figures have masks on, especially these women right here. You notice the lady there with the mask, and she's holding the lovely bouquet of flowers. If you were a society woman, you would go there, and you could, in other words, you could mingle with the crowd if you kept your mask on, because nobody would know who you were, all right? But if you didn't mingle with the crowd, then you would sit up there in the balcony and you can see people, and you also see two little feet hanging, two little legs hanging. That's because they had a trapeze artist swinging along to entertain you, all right? And there was music there, and probably a refreshment bar where you might get a glass of wine and whatever. Now, most women went in evening dress, and men also went in black evening dress. But occasionally, some women would appear looking like this, such as this woman right here, who's still wearing her mask. We don't know who she is. And there is somebody dressed as a Pierrot. That would probably be a guy who dressed up in that way. And there is another lady here wearing an outlandish costume, but she has had the temerity to take her mask off, and she is coming on to this guy right here. He's holding her elbow, and she's got her hand on his shoulder. She's coming on to this guy. So in other words, this could be a place also which we would call a pickup place, okay? But again, it was the mingling of all the levels of society. Even somebody who was, let's say, let's say a seamstress could run up a little costume for herself and then come here and mingle with a society lady who is dressed like this, and mingle with men who obviously were quite well off. This kind of clothing would have cost a lot of money in those days, and still have a lot of fun, because you could go up in the balcony and look down at the group, or you could observe the trapeze artist just swinging and doing her thing. And we are going to see twinkle toes like that again tonight. We're going to see twinkle toes again, all right? Now, what about this one? The corner of a cafe concert. Now, he did not do this at a cafe. This is still studio work. Most of the Impressionists went out to the cafe, they went out to the streets, they went out to the gardens, but with Manet, his work is studio work, and that was another reason why he did not embrace that aspect of the Impressionist aesthetic. Now, the cafes became very, very fashionable in the 18th century, selling coffee. Voltaire's favorite cafe, Café Procope, is still on the left bank in Paris, and it's still in business. Now, these cafes flourished with the opening of the streets, the widening of the streets. These cafes flourished, but in 1877. 2,200 of them were shut down as a way to stifle political opposition, because people would meet at the cafes and they would, plot against the government. So 2,200 of them were closed down. Now, in this one, the waitress serves beer with now there is a smocked workman sitting right here with a pipe, okay? But next to him is a middle-class guy who is wearing a bowler hat. She is serving this fellow, but she's also looking out that way to see if any other customers need her attention. Now, Manet compresses the space. It looks very crowded because the people are right at the picture plane, and there are other heads. For example, there was live music in this cafe, as witnessed by here. You can see the head of one of the musicians, and you can also see a man who's playing a bass fiddle. And here there was also a stage, and there is a dancer, but again, she's been cut off, and we only see half of her. Again, the influence of photography, you see. So in other words, this is quite a lively cafe. There's music, and it's a bunch of crowded bunch of people. They're smoking, they're drinking, and they are also watching the entertainment. Now, again, the singer on stage suggests the entertainment that was available at these cafes. And the Parisians, all of them, the working class and the middle class, enjoy these entertainments. Now, let's look at this one. Street pavers, Rue Mosnier. Opposite Manet's studio window was a new street that was being opened up, and Manet chose to document it in a series of paintings and drawings. This is part of the metamorphosis of Paris, which the Impressionists were so eager to capture. Here he records the pavers on the job. Now, in the 19th century, both French and English artists recorded the works of everyday laborers as a fit subject, another example of modernity. Well, I can do a picture of a Ragpicker. I can also do one of a gypsy, but I can also do one of the guys paving the streets. Now, But notice, though, that the street traffic and the sidewalk activity continues despite the encroachment of the pavers. The street, in other words, commerce must go on. Life must go on, even though they're paving the street. Well, we've still got to do what we have to do and get where we have to go. Now, many of these projects were rushed to completion because in 1878 there was another World's Fair to mark France's recovery from the defeat and humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War. Now, here's another view of Rue Mosnier after the pavers have finished. Obviously, it's probably, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if this was Bastille Day. Look at the sun. You can tell there's an awful lot of sun on the street, okay? The rubble has been cleared away and put behind this rather crudely built fence right here. And there, look, the gas light is there, the new gas lights, which is something new that Haussmann put in. But in the front here, right in the front, unmistakable, he puts a man who has only one leg and is walking on crutches. This obviously is one of the veterans of the Franco-Prussian War. And to kind of, I don't know, rub it in a little bit, he has another man, an unseen man, right behind him carrying a ladder, reminding us that this man can no longer work because he can't climb a ladder anymore. Right? Now, this man looks anonymous to us, but Manet also did a drawing of him. He came to probably to Manet's studio, wanted to draw him, and he did a frontal drawing of him, which today is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is not on view all the time. The last time I saw it was maybe about 2 or 3 years ago. But as you go up the main steps and turn left, you will see that it's a gallery of old drawings and engravings and lithographs, and that hung there, but it was the man facing forward, and it was the same, well, I'm assuming it's the same person because he was wearing the same clothing, okay? So, in other words, Manet is reminding us that there were an awful lot of crippled men who could no longer work for a living because he couldn't do anything with a ladder. Now, the next painting, let's see here. The Gare Saint-Lazare. The Impressionists were fascinated with train stations, and they painted many pictures, especially Monet, but so did Manet as well. It would be like, I'm an artist and I'm suddenly going to go to Newark Airport and I'm going to paint the runway at Newark Airport. In other words, well, it's 21st century technology. I'll be putting in some Boeing aircraft, maybe a Boeing aircraft taking off, and some Boeing aircraft there being unloaded, and the new Dreamliner. I made sure I put a new Dreamliner in that picture to show you that I was really modern. I'm not going to show you a 747 anymore. They're all out of commission, as you well know. But this is the 19th century equivalent of what I would do today. First of all, the train is coming. We don't see the train. All we see is the chugging, the smoke that the train is casting off, and the little girl has turned her attention to looking. She's standing by the grating there, which of course keeps people from falling onto the track. And the little girl, beautifully done little girl, who is standing there looking at the train coming toot toot into the station. Children are always fascinated by trains. Okay, even the miniature trains of that you put around the Christmas tree. Now, sitting next to her is none other than our old friend Victoria Murant again, and here she is taking the role probably of the babysitter or maybe a nanny, but she's not dressed like a nanny, so I would think maybe the mother or the aunt of the child. And the little girl was obviously she has the little puppy there, and the little girl must have been petting the puppy and looking at the book, but suddenly the train came by and she turned around and wearing a beautiful dress, is she not? And I want to show you a close-up, a detail of this painting. The puppy and the hands of Victorine Murant. There it is. You can see his brushstroke. You can see the way he puts his shadows in. The shadows are on the lace here, on the cuffs, are kind of a bluish bluish shadows right here, and she's wearing a bracelet, and there's a shadow cast by the bracelet. And look at the puppy. Look at the strokes right here. The strokes of the puppy. But when you look at it from far away, it all works so beautifully. The sleepy little puppy, the little pink nose, beautifully done. Absolutely. In other words, his hand was getting much surer, more sure of himself. And the strokes are very, very quite broad. And again, because they knew the eye would blend all this when you looked at it from far away. Very, 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 very well done right here. And I wanted to show this because sometimes when you look at a painting, you've got to go and look at it very close. And as I always tell all my students, remember, I am showing you a reproduction of a reproduction. And a lot of the impact of it is lost. Because it's a reproduction. It's like I'm saying, I'm going to give you a piece of cake, and what do I put on the plate but a picture of a piece of cake? Not much of a piece of cake, is it? You can't taste it, you can't smell it. Well, it's the same thing right here. And I searched many times. In fact, even with this lecture, I went into it and I said, I'm going to try to look for better pictures. I'm always changing the pictures if I can find one that's better, that has a better reproduction or better of color values or whatever, in order to give you something as close as possible to the original, but it's very difficult to do. So, all right, now we're going to start talking of some of his other late works. Starting in the 70s, I want to show this to you because this is very, very amusing. This is Monet, whom we will discuss in our next lecture, working in his garden in 1874 with his wife and his little boy sitting in the garden. Now, Monet went to visit them in Argenteuil. Manet went to visit Monet and his wife at Argenteuil. And when he got there, it was a Sunday afternoon, he said, give me a canvas and some paint. He said, I'm going to paint you in the garden. Meanwhile, who decides to visit is but Renoir. Renoir comes in and he said, well, I'd like to do a painting too. So he takes some canvas, he takes some paint, he starts painting. And Monet says to Manet, Manet says to this man, Monet, tell your friend he really should stop painting because he doesn't have any talent at all. This is Renoir he's talking about, okay? Now, they both finish the painting. Each of them basically is the same thing. This one's at the Met. The other one is not in the Met, and I don't know where the Renoir one is. But this one is at the Met, and basically the same subject. They gave both of them to Monet, and again, casual poses, capturing a slice of summer living. There is Camille wearing very fashionable clothes. Monet always wanted his wife wearing fashionable clothes, the latest clothes she had to have. And the little boy looks a bit lethargic there. He looks like he's kind of antsy, or maybe he's falling asleep, because kids don't like to sit still, and you know that, okay? But anyway, there is Monet with his watering can. And by the way, Sunday I went to the Met because of the new exhibition they have there on private spaces and gardens, Paris gardens. And they had a display of 19th century watering cans, of all things. And it was from a guy's collection. This guy collected 19th century watering cans. And there was one just like this in the case. Just like this. Monet, in fact, Monet said the reason he became an artist is because of flowers. He loved flowers so much that he wanted to do nothing but paint them. And here he is working in his garden. He was a consummate gardener. How many of you have been to Giverny? Of course, a consummate gardener. He designed those gardens, and they are still there and still world famous. Now let's look at the next one here. Now here is another portrait, but I didn't put it with the portraits because this is a slightly different than a conventional portrait. This was a very well-received entry to the Salon in 1882. It is subtitled Spring and was meant to be part of a series of 4 seasonal portraits, but only 2 of them were completed because Manet died in 1881. All right, he died at the age of 50, possibly he had turned 51 at the time. No, he born in 1832. I'm sorry. He died in 1833, I believe. It was 50 or 51 when he died. So the other two paintings were never completed. This is not actually meant to be a portrait. She is supposed to be the personification of spring. Her name, by the way, she was an actress. Her name was Jeanne Desmarais. In November of 2014, it was sold at Christie's in New York, and they assumed that it would go for $35 million. Well, the Getty came and snapped it up at $61 million because Manets do not come up for auction every day. Probably the next Manet that will come up for auction might be in another 5 or 10 years, and if a museum wants one, they're going to have to pay the freight, if you know what I mean. Now, this is considered a captivating painting, but painting women as the seasons were popular at a time when so much effort and money was spent on the elaborate dresses and accessories you had to have. You had to have parasol. You had to have a hat. She also has matching gloves that match the parasol with all the lace and everything else, and he places her in front of this wonderful vegetation, this outcropping, so that you can barely determine the difference between her costume here, the dress that she is wearing, which is flower sprigged, and the greenery right here. It almost appears as if they are one, except for the line. He puts a little line right here. But here in the back, it's very difficult to figure out, well, there's a green line right here, but it's very difficult to figure out where she ends and the foliage begins, is it not? And then, of course, even the hat has the ruffles, just like flowers are ruffled, and the parasol has ruffles on it, and there's this big black bow that sets off her gorgeous face. So all of these things cost an arm and a leg, not to mention the boots and the stockings and everything else. They wore a whole lot more clothes than we do. All right, it's fairly obvious. Corsets and whatnot, and the underskirts and the dresses and all that kind of thing. So, but it all works so beautifully together, and it's really very lovely. Now, Zola wrote a book called Nana, and I'm going to show you his version of Nana. Okay. The character of Nana initially appeared in Zola's book called L'Assommoir in 1876 as the daughter of an alcoholic laundress. Assommoir means the drinker. So in other words, it was realism in literature. An alcoholic laundress? Who wants to read a book about that, you know? Anyway, Zola was later to write a novel, Nana, using her as the main character. Here Manet paints her, that, by the way, this is another actress, a well-known one, Henriette Hauser, who was the mistress of the Prince of Orange, no less, preparing for an evening out. Nana prepares for an evening out while her lover watches. So in other words, she is his kept woman, and it was perfectly all right for him to sit there and watch her get ready to go out in the evening. She is wearing, she's still in her corset, and she's got a slip-on with some lace on it. And notice that she stands in front of the sofa, and the sofa embraces her, but it also embraces him as well, showing that she belongs to him, all right? Now, but Nana looks out at us in a very, very saucy way, does she not, to assess the impact she is making upon us. Now, she sits there, she stands there looking again with this insouciance, and with his stick and his leg almost touching hers, we know that she belongs to him, until of course something better comes along. Because look at the very saucy expression, the little smile on her face. So in other words, we know that she's shall we say, climbing the ladder of success. Okay, so. Again, this would have been quite a naughty painting at the time. But again, the novel was very popular, so everyone would have known when they saw the title Nana what this was all about, you see, because Zola's book sold very well. Now, we're going to look at another work here. This is Goya's Mahas and Mahos on a balcony. And you can see where Manet got his caped figure with the hats over the, the hat over his eyes. You can see where he picked that up. And of course, he also uses in the painting of the Gare Saint-Lazare, he used a railing, correct? And we see a railing here as well. Now, he was to translate this into something very, very similar. It's called The Balcony from 1868. The composition and subject matter were inspired by Goya. The figures themselves are framed by shutters and also the railing in the front, which Manet was to repeat in a number of his works. Who were the models? Well, this is his sister-in-law, or soon-to-be sister-in-law, Berthe Morisot. You could see she had black hair, because she's not wearing a hat, and she's wearing a very fashionable dress at the time with very, very wide lace, sheer sleeves, and obviously it's a summer dress. Behind her is another painter, Anton Goulmet, who was a friend of Manet's, and also here's another lady, Franny Hauser, who was a violinist, and they are all on the balcony creating what we would call a pyramidal composition. There is the railing, and then the apex of the composition is his head and there. And in the background here, Leon Leenhoff is coming into the room bringing something with him, all right? But you just get a glimpse of him here. Now, all of these three figures are totally independent of each other. None of them by either gesture or look are interacting with each other. And it has been said of Manet's figures that each of these are a still life unto themselves, because they exist in their own reality and they do not make a connection with anybody in the painting or even with us. Now, this painting is absolutely gorgeous. It really is. And he also tweaks the scene a little bit. He tweaks the angle of vision. You would have to be in midair to see the scene head on. Okay, but none of us are on a ladder. But you would have to be. But he tweaks it a little bit so that it looks like we are looking at them head on. Now, the most gorgeous thing about this painting, which does not show here, all right, is her. Wait, oops, I'm sorry. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Sorry, is her dress. This one right here. It looks like it was painted with vanilla ice cream. I cannot say it any other way. You've got to go to see it in real life, because it looks like vanilla or whipped cream or vanilla ice cream. It is absolutely beyond gorgeous. It really, really is. But you don't see it there. It just looks like a white dress. Again, because we are looking at a reproduction of a reproduction, and the further you get away from the reality, the more, shall we say, fuzzy it becomes. But beautiful painting, just exquisite. Now, the next one. Here is his stepson, Leon Leenhoff, when Leon was about 15 years old. 15, maybe 16 years old, dressed up as a young man, luncheon in the studio. He's leaning against a table that's set with some food. And notice that there is a small still life right here, okay? And the table, you can even see the patterning of the tablecloth, which the Dutch artists would always do. They would always do the patterning, and you would also see the creases where the tablecloth had been folded. Now, next to him there is a chair, and on the chair are a number of studio props that Manet used in his studio, including some armor. When he was a little boy, Manet did a painting of him walking into the room carrying a huge bunch of studio props, including the helmet. So now he uses the helmet again, and with Leon Leenhoff, to remind people of the fact that he had done the portrait of him. Now, a servant also comes into the room to put something on the table. Again, the figures do not they are living in their own reality. He is not looking at us. He's looking off somewhere. The maid is not looking at it, and neither is the man. There is a man here wearing a hat, which means he must be a visitor because he still has his hat on, and he's sitting there and he's smoking, but he's turned away from us. So all of these people live in a kind of reality of their own. Now let me also. On the chair, I want to show this to you. I don't know if you can see it. Next to this, next on the chair, the studio props, where the studio props are, there is a black cat, but it's very, very hard to read, a black cat. Now, we've talked about that, and there's another black cat there, but it's very, very difficult to read the black cat, all right? It doesn't look like a black cat. That's why you got to see the real painting. Okay, but again, there was a potted plant behind, and the still life on the table. It really, they're totally still. And as a matter of fact, a book was written a few years ago called Manet and the Poetics of Silence, because all of his figures are very silent. They do not in any way react to what is around them or to what is outside of them. No reaction whatsoever. Now, I'm going to show you, start with talking about a painting that he did just about a year before he died, to a year and a half before he died, and it is considered his masterwork. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Oh, oops, I'm sorry. There's one more before. There's one more. It's called In the Conservatory. We see a very fashionably dressed couple occupying a space with cymbidium orchids and very exotic tropical foliage. By the way, he used the conservatory of an artist that he knew in order to do this painting. It's a contemporary theme of a middle-class couple taking their leisure and going through what they called a conservatory, which was really a greenhouse. And it was fashionable to build these onto your houses so that you could have, indeed, orchids. These are cymbidium orchids. They're not cattleyas, they're cymbidiums. But the orchids were still considered very, very exotic plants because they had not been introduced into Europe until the 1820s. And the belief was that they were very hard to grow, and at the very beginning, until horticulturists figured out how to grow them, they were difficult to grow. They are, you try to replicate the jungle if you can, and they need a particular amount of light and a particular amount of water, and most people who buy an orchid lose it because they overwater them. They drown the orchids. It looks like it's dying. Let me drown it in water, and it just makes it worse. Okay, now the couple in mind here, she was an American, by the way, and his name was Jules Guillemets, and he owned a very, very chic store, a department type store in Paris. And Zola wrote about this in The Lady's Paradise, the growth of the department store, okay, which was where you could go in and you could buy everything from a pair of man's socks to a bib for your baby and a hat for yourself, okay, all in one store, and then you could also have a cup of tea in the tea room. And a woman could feel safe there because it was all other women shopping there as well, and you didn't feel in any way intimidated. Now, they are seated again. He's using here the railing. You notice the bench she's seated on has vertical spokes, and there's the chair. Now, I can almost guarantee you that Manet asked her to wear this dress, and that he took those pleats in that dress and put them as a counterpoint to the verticals right here, the counterpoint of the diagonal and the diagonal of that umbrella, that parasol, I should say. And notice her yellow gloves match the yellow hat, and her hat almost looks like a bowl of flowers, does it not? Now, there is only one discordant note in this painting, and I take Robert Herbert talks about it, but he dismisses it, and I don't dismiss it. Right in the middle of the painting, a tremendous tension is created in the painting. Smack dab in the middle, she has her arm on the back of the bench, and his hand is next to hers. but they are not touching at all, and it creates a tension within this painting. Now, Robert Herbert, who's a Yale art historian, says, well, it was proper that the couple not touch in public, and it really doesn't create any tension, but I think it does. First of all, Manet places it smack dab in the middle of the painting. Now, if he had moved that man's hand, and let's say the man had folded his hands, all the tension would be gone. All the tension in the painting would be gone. But there is an indication that their relationship may not be as charming as it looks. Notice that she is looking out. He is looking at her, but she is looking out, and she is not, almost totally unaware of his presence. And again, if you think of that hand, of the man's hand moving, and let's say just fold it up, the tension would be gone. But notice how he points, he's pointing at her hand, and it's almost like, I think of the Sistine ceiling where God gives Adam the spark of life, the two fingers very close together. You know, I'm sure you're familiar with that. Well, that's what that reminds me of. And I do take umbrage at him saying that that doesn't create a tension in the painting. It really does. But it's a marvelous painting. It is in Berlin. I went to Berlin 3 years ago because I wasn't going to die without seeing that painting. I absolutely adore it. And it was a wonderful experience seeing it. The only thing is I didn't like the lighting in the Berlin Museum because it created a lot of hot spots on everything. But it was just marvelous to see. It truly, truly was. And I would suggest if you ever go there to please, you know. Now, Zola talked about Manet's figures, and he said his figures have an elegant stiffness. The flowers and the foliage and the color harmonies of the dress are just marvelous here. She was, again, an American, and it was fashionable to portray women in this way because the fashion magazines, the French fashion magazines, would show the latest fashions, but they always pictured women in gardens wearing the latest clothes. And you're going to see that next month when I give the lecture on Monet. You're going to see that, all right? And that was all taken from the French fashion magazines because they finally had mastered the lithograph process, and then they would have many of these, before they mastered coloring the lithographs, but automatically, they would have women sitting and painting these figures for the magazine. And of course, they probably pay these poor souls maybe a penny or two per page. But these paintings were, these lithographs were very laboriously hand colored by women who just sat there doing that all day long, like playing with a coloring book. Okay, so now. Let's go on. I want to show you this. This is a poster for the Folies Bergère in Paris, and from 1875, this poster is. The poster reads, every evening at 8 o'clock, acrobatic acts, ballets, pantomimes, operettas, Au Mitral, that's the name, Oscar perhaps, Oscar Mitral and his orchestra, one price, 2 francs, all spots not reserved. In other words, if you had 2 francs and you were dressed decently, you could go into this, all right? A woman would be expected to wear a nice dress. If she was a laundress, she couldn't come in with her sleeves rolled up, all right? She had to be dressed appropriately. We see here the horseshoe balcony that they had. Also, we see a clown over here, all right, just talking about the orchestra, and a crowd of people, and here's someone, a gentleman coming in, all right, and paying his way in, and there's a balcony there, and it's all sorts of goings on, all right? Now, Manet decided that he wanted to paint this. This is a study for the painting in 1881. It's an oil study. When you were going, this is a huge painting, by the way. It's at the Warburg Courtauld Institute in Paris. In London on the Strand. The Strand, they have the Warburg Courtauld Institute where this is displayed, and it's a huge painting. But before you invested all your time in doing the huge painting, you would do a couple of oil studies, small canvases where you would sketch out the figures, and you can see it's not very well worked out. I mean, it's just kind of sketched in, but he was working with certain ideas that he had in his head, all right? So this is one of the preliminary studies for the painting itself. And these also now are hang in museums because they are considered a way of tracing the thought processes of the artist as he was creating the painting. Now, this is one of the studies. The finished painting doesn't look like this, not really. He's moved the woman over. He's changed the still life in the front. The lights are still there. Now, remember, this was illuminated by electric light. Okay, this was a really, really big thing. It was brightly illuminated. And here is the final painting. Very large painting. It's, in fact, they have a bench in front of it so you could sit down and spend your time admiring it. Now, the Folies Bergère was, as I said, one of the premier music halls in Paris, where all layers of society mingled, just so long as you could afford to come in and you were dressed nicely. Now, done 2 years before his death, it is a fitting masterpiece to a body of work that helped to redirect the aesthetic philosophy of art. Two themes are united here: urban nightlife and labor, presented by the central figure of the barmaid who leans on the bar, looking rather tired, I think, and certainly not engaged by the revelry that is around her, or in the revelry that is reflected in the mirror. Remember I told you about Twinkle Toes? Well, there's Twinkle Toes again. There she is again. It was so obviously they had trapeze artists, and they probably had a couple of them swinging around. And everybody's looking at them, and the music is playing, and the clowns are running around. So this was like a indoor circus, you know, three-ring circus. Now, the woman herself, the young girl herself, has been here. Well, I'll bet she had to come before the place opened and set up the bar and whatnot. She leans on the bar. She looks like she's tired. She is a part of the scene, but she is not a part of it, if you know what I mean. She's there, but she's really not there because she looks awfully tired to me. Now, there's a beautiful still life here in the front, and I believe that this still life may have inspired Renoir when he was doing his still life for the Luncheon of the Boating Party in the same year, in 1881. He was doing that painting, okay? And I am sure that he may have been inspired by it. And we are actually there because we are standing there and we see the reflection of all the stuff that's going on and the bright lights and whatnot. But again, she is not taking that in at all. Now, Manet also tweaks this because it looks as if there's another girl there. But actually, that is her reflection in the window, and there is the patron in front of her. He's actually standing probably right about here, next to where we would be standing, because we would be standing here. And so, but we don't see him. He's unseen, okay? He's unseen. He's maybe not close enough to the bar. He may be a few inches away, and that's the reason why we don't see him on this side. But that is a reflection, and again, Manet tweaked it because if he had put the reflection actually should be behind her, but he moved the reflection over here so that we know that this is, and it really looks like another figure. When I first saw this, I thought it was another figure, but it's not. It's actually the reflection of this girl right here. So in other words, this was really a fitting ending to his career because it really is a masterwork. It truly is absolutely amazing. We can see all this wonderful stuff happening, and she is like totally unaware of it. She looks exhausted, but I think there is also mental exhaustion as well as physical exhaustion. Now, I think we have some time. Do we have... Oh, yes, it's after 9 already. My goodness, I always run overboard. I'm sorry. If you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. And I want to thank you ever so much for coming and giving me your attention.